afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are just about to start next press conference here at GLOBSEC. It's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Mr. Vershbow.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back in Bratislava and back at GLOBSEC. This forum makes an essential contribution to shaping the European and transatlantic agenda. And this year it's as important as ever, both as a key platform to discuss NATO's priorities ahead of our summit in Warsaw in July, and second because we are dealing with one of the most challenging security situations in Europe in many decades. The challenges come from both the East and the South, and NATO is trying to take decisive action in response to the challenges from both directions. Since the Wales Summit in 2014, we've been implementing the greatest strengthening of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War. We've tripled the size of the NATO response force with our new high readiness spearhead force at its core. We've set up a chain of new headquarters in the eastern part of our alliance, including one here in Slovakia, boosting our ability to plan, exercise, and reinforce if needed. And we're reversing the long decline in defense spending with a halt in the cuts in most allied countries last year, and many countries now increasing defense spending. In July, at the summit meeting in Warsaw, we will take the next steps to further strengthen our defense and deterrence. We'll enhance the forward presence of multinational forces in the eastern part of the alliance. We'll increase our resilience against hybrid warfare and cyber threats. We'll advance the goal of a Europe whole and free with the admission of Montenegro as a member. And we'll reconfirm our long-term commitment to Afghanistan through our resolute support mission and through continued financial support to the Afghan security forces. And we will agree on further measures to respond to the challenges coming from the Middle East and North Africa. In particular, strengthening our ability to train, advise, and assist local forces. We're already working closely with Iraq, Jordan, and Tunisia to help them bolster their security. But the Secretary General and I think we could be doing a lot more to support countries on our southern flank. For instance, Libya, because in the end, the fight against terrorism includes building local capacity. It's one of the best weapons that we have. So we have a broad agenda which we put under the rubric of long-term adaptation of the alliance to keep our alliance strong, open to dialogue, and working with our partners around the world. So with that, I'm ready to answer questions.
Okay, so now it's space for your questions. Over there.
It's Kostis Geropoulos from New Europe newspaper in Brussels. You mentioned
Can you get a little loud noise?
Yeah, it's Kostis Geropoulos from New Europe newspaper in Brussels. You mentioned the threat of the south and also the threat of in the Middle East and Northern Africa. Do you consider Daesh to be the number one priority and in terms of number one threat now? And also, how would you rank Russia? I mean, it seems like we heard from President Putin during direct line talk that there was a sort of conciliatory tone. So is Russia another big threat for Europe, or is not as much as Daesh? Thank you.
Okay. So you're going to turn off this ventilator here? It's like it's very loud. Okay, well, we'll turn up the microphone. I mean, I heard the question, but it's very hard to hear. It's like I have an airplane behind me here. I'm not sure we're setting a rank order of the threats. Clearly, Daesh is perhaps the most pernicious of the terrorist groups that are confronting, first of all, the Middle East, but now also our own societies. But Al-Qaeda is still out there. Other groups like Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab in Somalia. But ISIL or Daesh, with its aspiration to build a so-called caliphate and establish the attributes of a state, is proving to be a more formidable challenger than maybe some of the other groups. and it requires a broad international strategy, of which NATO is only one player. The coalition, of course, that is fighting Daesh, especially in Iraq and Syria, is led by the United States, but all the allies are contributing in one way or another. And then there's other international efforts to weaken Daesh by cutting off its financial support, its oil business, by trying to control the movements of the foreign fighters that go to the Middle East and come back and create havoc in our own societies. There's the long-term ideological battle to discredit its twisted version of Islam, which must be led by the Muslim world itself. But I think NATO's role is both in ensuring that our forces in the coalition are as interoperable as possible. That's a kind of our long-term role in the past. But in the future, I emphasize again, trying to help shore up, to build up the capacity of other Middle Eastern states threatened by Daesh, so that the spread can be better contained through the efforts of the international community and the countries who are threatened themselves. As for your question about President Putin, obviously we still have very fundamental problems in terms of Russian policy, even if the tone changes from one day to the next. Most fundamentally, we still face unacceptable Russian aggression against Ukraine, a sovereign state which has seen its part of its territory illegally annexed, and its eastern provinces destabilized through an insurgency that's organized and paid for and commanded from Moscow, with Russian troops directing the separatists in eastern Ukraine. But we will talk to Russia, and we'll have a meeting next week of the NATO-Russia Council, in which we'll give our assessment of Russia's responsibility for the current situation, urge Russia to fully implement the Minsk agreements, but also discuss Russian provocative military activities, which have created the risk of accidental conflict, and we think call for returning to measures of risk reduction and transparency, which Russia has been avoiding for some time. So it's a difficult relationship. Russia needs to change its behavior in Ukraine, but dialogue is part of the effort to bring Russia back to policies that we can accept.
Next questions?
Jan Lopatka at Reuters. Can you hear me despite the jets buzzing behind your head?
I'll step forward a little bit. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to shout more. I was going to ask about the agenda for the NATO-Russia Council meeting. We just talked about that. But is this meeting actually a sign of normalization, not normalization, improvement in relations, or is this an effort to avert any kind of unwanted escalation? We've seen these provocative acts by the Russian jets in the past week and so on. So which direction is it going is question number one. Question number two relates to what you talked about earlier during the panel, and that is the role of NATO in Northern Africa and Middle East potentially in the longer term. Just yesterday there was news that the EU was ready to assist the new Libyan government in training and improving the security situation. Is there any role for NATO in this as well? Thank you.
The meeting of the NATO-Russia Council, let's start with that question. The meeting on Wednesday next week is not meant in any way to signal a normalization of the relation with Russia. When they illegally annexed Crimea and soon after that launched the destabilization of eastern Ukraine, our leaders, in this case it was our foreign ministers, agreed that we had to suspend all practical cooperation with Russia, which had been taking place under the umbrella of the NATO-Russia Council, and that remains our position, that at a time when Russia is violating international law and many other agreements, basically violating the rules of European security, there can be no business as usual. But when we took that decision, we agreed that we should keep channels of communication open, and that included the possibility of meetings of the NATO-Russia Council at the level of our ambassadors. We had 2 such meetings in the spring of 2014, but it hasn't been used since that time. So this is more a resumption of dialogue, but not a normalization. As I said, the agenda will be the crisis in and around Ukraine, including the need for full implementation of the Minsk agreements. We'll talk about the military activities that concern us and the need for transparency and risk reduction. I'm sure the Russians will raise concerns about NATO activities, but we think we have a good story to tell in that regard. And lastly, we'll exchange assessments of the situation in Afghanistan. Not that we will likely go back to cooperation, but it's obviously an area that affects both NATO's and Russia's security, and so that will be the third topic. On the other question, the progress towards the consolidation of this new government of national unity in Libya is encouraging, and we stand ready to assist that government if it requests. 2 years ago, we were very close to implementing a program to assist the government at the time in Libya in helping to develop and reform its defense institutions. And of course, Libya under Gaddafi, as someone said at the conference today, basically had no institutions. So it's starting from a very rudimentary base. But if this new government requests NATO assistance in this same area, we stand ready to help them out. And indeed, we have other potential ways we could assist if they ask, but of course those would have to be decided by all 28 allies.
Okay, please, the question here.
Yeah, hello, this is Andrew Redmond from EU Observer in Brussels. It's about the NATO mission in the Aegean Sea on surveillance of migratory flows. Can you give us an assessment on how successful that's been in helping to manage the situation? Also, whether NATO vessels have had to rescue any people from the water? And then going on, whether there is whether NATO can develop this role, for example, by surveillance of migratory flows also in North Africa or deeper in the Middle East.
Yeah, the operation in the Aegean, which was decided in February, based on a proposal from Germany, Greece, and Turkey, has been underway now for several weeks. It's still not deployed fully in all the areas that were envisaged, but already we can see some positive results. I don't know the latest statistics, but last week we heard an update indicating that a significant number, I think between 2 and 3 dozen, I don't know the precise figure, of illegal smuggling vessels were first identified by the NATO mission and enabled an earlier alert to go to the responsible authorities, the Turkish and Greek coast guards, as well as Frontex, and at least in some cases it enabled them to intercept. So that's how it's supposed to work. NATO is providing surveillance to support the responsible agencies, but they do the actual interdiction of the illegal ships. As far as I know, NATO hasn't been called upon to rescue any migrants who were at risk of sinking, but that NATO has that authority. It's an international obligation for all vessels to help people in distress. That, as far as I know, hasn't happened yet. Could this be a broader mission? It's something allies would have to debate. The European Union, of course, is conducting an Operation Sophia in the central Mediterranean aimed at controlling illegal smuggling from North Africa, and Libya in particular, to Europe. At the moment, the EU has not sought the same sort of NATO support, but if they were to do so, I think the experience gained in the Aegean would would help us in answering that call. But the EU seems to feel it has it covered, at least up till now.
Okay, next question over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Matusz David. I'm from Slovak Public Television. I have just one question. This summer, NATO summit will be held in Warsaw. It will be near the Russian border. Do you think, or can you believe, it could stigmatize results of the summit? And in connection with this, do you think, what about Polish expectations about permanent presence of NATO in Poland?
I think any nation that hosts a NATO summit is proud to do so, and it's of course a moment for all the allies to come together in solidarity. So I don't see any danger of stigmatizing the decisions or the event. In fact, I'm optimistic that it will be a very significant show of unity on the part of the alliance in terms of strengthening our defense and deterrence, supporting our neighbors in the east and in the south, and showing that the alliance is able to adapt to the significant challenges of the time. This issue of forward presence will be high on the list of decisions. The details still have to be worked out, so I can't describe to you what it will entail, but we already know from the decisions of our defense ministers in February that this enhanced forward presence needs to be multinational. It'll be rotational as opposed to permanent, but it will be a continuous rotational presence with real combat capability aimed at demonstrating to any aggressor that if they challenge the borders of NATO, they would encounter not just home defense forces, but Americans and Europeans as well. So in other words, they would be taking on the whole alliance. So I think that all allies agree on these basic principles, including that this would be a rotational presence. And I think we heard from Minister Waszczykowski yesterday that that rotational presence is supported by Poland for the Warsaw Summit.
Thank you. Next question here.
Thank you. Andrzej Matuszek, Daily Pravda. Yesterday, Reuters agency published an article with the headline, Al-Qaeda re-emerged as a challenge for US NATO in Afghanistan. After 15 years, we went to Afghanistan, we have headlines like this. How do you assess the situation in Afghanistan vis-a-vis NATO presence? Thank you.
Well, we believe the overall trends in Afghanistan have been favorable, with the Afghan security forces who now have the full responsibility for the fight, steadily gaining capability, improving their leadership, their ability to counter the Taliban and other threats. That being said, the Taliban has proven to be very pernicious, and there are manifestations of other terrorist groups, but I think the Taliban is still the main adversary in Afghanistan. But there's also branches, perhaps self-branding themselves, of Daesh. But a new fighting season has begun. NATO is committed to continuing to advise and assist and train the Afghan security forces, and to support the efforts of the National Unity Government there to improve the strategic direction of the forces. So we're still confident that things are improving. Still a lot of challenges ahead, but I think the sense that Afghanistan is worth further investment is reflected in the fact that allies have already decided that we will extend the current Resolute Support mission into 2017, and that we will, of course, stay engaged with Afghanistan over the longer term, even after Resolute Support is completed. We will move from a military-led training mission to a civilian-led mission under what's called the Enduring Partnership for Afghanistan. So we're not going to turn our backs on Afghanistan, but the threats are still there. Afghans have tough fight on their hands, but they are steadily improving.
Next question. Do you have any other questions? If not, thank you very much,
Okay.
Mr. Vershbow, for being
Thanks
with
very
us. And we will see each other in a couple of minutes in next press conference. Thank you.